Now, yesterday I created a video and I titled it Debunking the Jumbo Jet Argument, and I posted this video, and in swooped Are You Talking to Me? And very, very, very cleverly put his finger on the one point that I had sort of glossed over a little bit. So, no, this is very much appreciated, and yes, by all means feel free to tease me. People who can't stand being teased. Anyway, okay, so, yes, you brought up the term abiogenesis, and the problem, I immediately responded mentioning creationists, and my first response wasn't great, but my second response I used a very good word. I said that creationists have been subverting the term abiogenesis to twist people's heads, and beneath all if you strip away everything that they're going on about, what it really boils down to is a statement of incredulity, and it boils down to, but surely whatever you can think of is either alive or it's not. And if you hear that just like that, your first response might be one of, duh. But you'd be wrong. Things aren't either alive or they're not. As in all things biological, there is always that uncomfortable, inconvenient grey bit in between that we cannot do anything with. Let me mention an article to you, and what I will do is I'll post it also in the credits there. It was written by Richard Dawkins, and it has nothing to do with abiogenesis, but it has to do with this mindset that keeps latching on to false dichotomies. It is titled Gaps in the Mind. And how does it apply to this particular case? Well, in my example, I talked about the origin of life as a whole, but I glossed it over, and I will admit that. I started talking about a soup of chemicals in which the chemicals themselves could be represented as nodes in a network, but a completely unconnected network, and then as reactions started happening between the chemicals, those would be connections between the nodes. And I mentioned something called a phase change, which is a very powerful mathematical construct that applies to an awful lot of things in nature, and it also applies to this particular case, where all the chemicals, as more and more chemicals start interacting with each other, you'll get into a situation where every chemical essentially interacts with every other chemical, albeit via intermediates. And therefore you've got this network of chemicals and their connections, in which every reaction provokes or produces more chemicals, but of course those chemicals stay within the context, and they are taking part in this whole soup again. So every input in the form of a chemical reacts with something and produces an output of another chemical, which then becomes an input into this whole system again, and you get what are called feedback loops. If you were to look at this soup as opposed to something that's dead and inert, you wouldn't find a steady equilibrium. Even if the soup, if this whole pot of stuff would appear to be in equilibrium, if you were to investigate it closely, you would see that there was a constant movement going on in there, of things going around and around. And more likely than not, you wouldn't be finding something remotely like an equilibrium, but you would be finding something oscillating between states or things like that. These are all things that happen in systems that are in feedback mode and that have gone through this phase change in any system, whether it's a mathematical model or physical systems in which this has been observed. It is something that makes no sense to a simplistic worldview, and I'm not meaning that as something that you are doing, but as in a simplistic view of this chemical produces that if it reacts with that. But it's a complex situation in which a lot of things are happening at once, and that's where that comes into play. Now, I in my video mentioned something about that being the start of life, but that was only, you know, if you were presented with a pot full of this goo, you would not call that life. Obviously not. And I don't think you'd be very hard pressed finding anybody on this planet who would call that life. And yet, about 100 million years later, or thereabouts, in that sort of ballpark, you'd find the most primitive single-celled organisms that you could not deny are living organisms. Now, present that situation to a lawyer. No life, 100 million years, and the lawyer will say, there therefore must be a point within those 100 million years at which point non-life changed to life. Now that is what Richard Dawkins is talking about in his article about gaps in the mind, because there is no such point. At the beginning you would clearly say this is not life, at the end you would clearly say this is life, but if you were presented with something in the middle, you would feel confused. You would not be able to make a definitive decision on what you're looking at there. And that is why I said the creationists would have subverted the notion of abiogenesis, because it is not an event. Abiogenesis is not an event in time. It is something that took a long time to do. Now, nobody knows exactly how it happened, but these ideas about feedback loops have been fleshed out by scientists already. There are some ideas about what might have happened in those 100 million years or so. This is not pure conjecture anymore. It is certainly supported by evidence, and people are making more than just educated guesses at this stage. Is it a fact? Well, you know, I don't believe in anything supernatural, and given a planet that was formed 5 billion years ago, on which there was no life, and given the situation a few 100 million years later where there definitely was life, the only conclusion is that obviously abiogenesis is a fact. Whether this is a fact that happened, whether you want to invoke a grand magician, a god, or a flying spaghetti monster sticking its oar in that time, is up to you really. But that doesn't change the fact that it did happen.